Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Now consider this. What if the most terrifying thing in cosmic horror isn't a creature, but a place? Not a monster hiding in the dark, but the space itself. Places that defy our geometry, undo our sense of time, and dissolve the border between dream and waking thought. In this episode, we trace the forgotten history of horrifying dimensions. Not alternate realities in the science fiction sense, but impossible regions of space that were never meant to be understood. Writers like H.P. Lovecraft didn't merely invent creatures from other worlds. They imagined worlds that reject meaning altogether. These dimensions aren't just settings. They are threats to the very idea of setting. They collapse language, challenge physics, and mock the limits of human thought. We'll examine where these concepts come from, how they've evolved, and what they reveal about our need to believe space has rules. Along the way, we'll visit some of the most disturbing dimensional encounters in literature, myth, and culture. The idea of horrifying dimensions did not emerge from fantasy in isolation. It formed during a period of deep intellectual rupture. Between roughly 1890 and 1930, Western thought absorbed discoveries that quietly dismantled the stable universe: non-Euclidean geometry, deep geological time, and relativistic space. Reality no longer appeared fixed or intuitive. Lovecraft encountered these ideas not as abstractions, but as existential threats. According to his letters, geometry unsettled him more than theology. Space, once neutral, became hostile. This reveals something profound. Cosmic horror does not begin with monsters, but with the realization that the universe's structure may be incompatible with human cognition. Dimensions arise here as consequences, not inventions. Logical extensions of a world that no longer guarantees orientation, meaning, or safety. These ideas did not originate with Lovecraft alone. Philosophical precedents prepared the ground. Plato's divided reality already suggested that what we perceive is not what exists. Kant later formalized this fracture by separating phenomena from noumena, what can be known versus what remains inaccessible. Consider this carefully. A dimension in cosmic horror functions much like the noumenal realm. It exists, shapes outcomes, yet resists direct comprehension. Gnostic cosmology goes further, portraying reality as layered and possibly hostile by design. Borges later condensed these anxieties into impossible spaces such as the Aleph, where totality collapses perception. Across these traditions, dimensions signal a recurring fear. That reality has deeper layers which do not care whether we can survive understanding them. Language struggles when confronting such spaces. The word dimension itself implies measurement, not habitation. This distinction matters. A realm invites narrative. A dimension denies it. Lovecraft's prose repeatedly turns to architectural and mathematical terms, angles, curves, intersections, because ordinary spatial language fails. Words like cyclopean or non-Euclidean operate less as descriptions than as alarms. They mark the point where language begins to break. Not poetic excess, but semantic failure. Triadic patterns recur: depth, angle, vastness, threshold, fold, gulf, measure, fracture, void. Each cluster gestures toward structure while withholding coherence. The dimension becomes not a place to imagine, but a limit case that exposes how little our descriptive systems can actually contain. This deliberate linguistic failure supports a broader myth-building strategy. Lovecraft rarely maps dimensions. He alludes to them through fragments, cult testimony, corrupted texts, disturbed witnesses. This method mirrors historical myth formation. where repetition of partial accounts creates perceived antiquity. We must pause here. Authenticity in cosmic horror does not come from detail, but from restraint. A fully explained dimension becomes navigable, and navigation implies mastery. Instead, these spaces appear consistent only in their effects: madness, dislocation, loss of scale. The result is a cosmology that feels discovered rather than designed. Not a universe with rules, but one with habits, patterns inferred too late to be useful. Examples across the canon demonstrate this approach. In The Call of Cthulhu, 1928, Rillia's geometry destabilizes perception without explanation. In The Dreams in the Witch House, 1933, mathematics becomes a portal, not a tool. In Through the Gates of the Silver Key, 1934, dimensional plurality erases identity itself. These are not different worlds, but different failures of orientation. Compare this to Dante's Inferno, where hell is carefully structured and morally legible. Cosmic horror rejects that clarity. These dimensions are not punitive, but indifferent. Not symbolic, but structural. Their horror lies in the absence of intention, not its excess. The implications extend beyond literature. Once space itself becomes suspect, human meaning systems lose their foundation. Science presumes stable dimensions. Religion presumes purposeful ones. Cosmic horror introduces a third option: spaces that exist without reference to either truth or value. Madness follows not because characters are weak, but because cognition evolved for a narrower universe. This is not ignorance punished, but knowledge mismatched. Not revelation, but overload. According to later critics, this shift reframes horror as epistemological rather than moral. Fear arises from understanding too much of the wrong thing. This brings us to the central problem the next section will confront. If such dimensions exist, however fiction frames them, what do they do to thought, identity, and causality? Origins explain how the idea formed. Nature and themes explain why it endures. We now move from historical emergence to philosophical consequence, where space ceases to be background and becomes an active force against meaning itself. The fear of incomprehensible space did not begin with modern science. Long before relativity or non-Euclidean geometry, cultures imagined layers of reality beyond human access. These traditions often treated space itself as unstable or morally charged, less as a container, more as a field of forces. In Gnostic cosmology, for example, the material world is a flawed simulation ruled by ignorant or malevolent archons. The true, unreachable realm lies beyond, accessible only through spiritual rupture. This dualism offers more than religious symbolism. It introduces a spatial hierarchy where our reality is both derivative and dangerous. The same structure reemerges in cosmic horror dimensions, not realms of torment, but zones of existential misalignment. Plato's theory of forms also anticipates this fracture. The physical world is a dim shadow of pure, abstract realities. What we perceive is never final. Though less overtly hostile than Gnosticism, it sets the stage for a crucial theme: knowledge as disorientation. To glimpse the higher form is not to gain control, but to realize one's prior ignorance. Lovecraft retools this concept. In his fiction, dimensional glimpses reveal not transcendent ideals, but meaningless infinities. Plato's ascent ends in wisdom. Lovecraft's ends in madness. The structure is preserved, but the promise is inverted. In Eastern traditions, dimensions often exist as fluid and permeable. Hindu and Buddhist cosmologies describe layers of existence where time flows differently. Beings evolve across lifetimes, and enlightenment involves moving beyond illusion. Here, Reality is not singular, but stratified. Importantly, illusion, Maya, is not malevolent, merely unstable. This yields a different kind of horror when refracted through a modern lens. What if our perceptions are not just incomplete, but accidental? Cosmic horror adopts this destabilization, strips it of spiritual guidance, and leaves only the gap. The goal is no longer transcendence, but survival without comprehension. Mythologies around liminal spaces also contributed. Celtic folklore warns of thin places, meadows, crossroads, and stones, where one might slip into another world. These tales are not about adventure, but about loss, of memory, of identity, of time. The danger lies not in the beings found there, but in the altered laws of space itself. Lovecraft's doorways, attics, cellars, remote plateaus echo this pattern. But again, the morale is altered. Traditional folklore offers rules. Leave offerings, avoid the path, don't speak. Cosmic horror removes such safeguards. The dimensional shift is structural, not voluntary. Protection is not possible because the space was never meant to include you. In the medieval Christian worldview, space was ordered. Earth below, heavens above, hell beneath. Even the chaotic had its place. Dante's Inferno offers a spatial diagram of sin, with every circle calibrated. But this order was collapsing by the 17th century. With the rise of scientific empiricism, space lost its moral structure and became coldly mechanical. Newtonian physics flattened the universe. Then, in the 19th century, that flatness fractured again. Non-Euclidean geometry made space bend. Einstein made it relative. Quantum theory made it probabilistic. These were not just scientific revolutions. They were epistemological earthquakes. Cosmic horror arises in this context. It doesn't reject science. It follows its implications beyond comfort. Literature also reflected these changes. Edgar Allan Poe hinted at abnormal spatial effects in stories like The Pit and the Pendulum, where architecture itself becomes a tool of terror. Later, writers like Ambrose Bierce, an inhabitant of Carcosa, and Robert W. Chambers, The King in Yellow, expanded spatial horror into the psychological. Their protagonists encounter ruins, cities, or books that imply other geometries of being. The landscape becomes symbolic, but also dangerously literal. It doesn't just reflect madness, it produces it. By the time Lovecraft inherits this tradition, the groundwork is laid. Space itself can be malignant. The significance of these antecedents lies not in influence alone, but in the recurring intellectual function of space. Across cultures and centuries, dimensions are treated not as somewhere else, but as structural revelations. They reveal what normal perception hides. Gnosticism uses this for salvation. Plato uses it for understanding. Cosmic horror weaponizes it for terror. In every case, the deeper layer invalidates the surface one, and in cosmic horror, the reader is denied resolution. There is no ascent, no return. The other space remains, leaking in, undermining all systems that once seemed secure. Next, we will examine the linguistic tools used to convey this instability. If cultures throughout history imagined layered or hostile realities, how do writers describe what the mind cannot hold? How does language gesture toward spatial ideas that language itself was never built to capture? That is the paradox we now approach. The word dimension carries a deceptive clarity. From the Latin dimensio, it implies something measurable, length, breadth, depth. It was once a neutral term, mathematical and abstract. But in cosmic horror, it undergoes mutation. It no longer describes spatial extent. It names a failure of perception. Lovecraft and his literary descendants stripped the word of its scientific security and recast it as something inherently threatening. The shift is subtle but critical. The term becomes a stand-in for the unknown, the unstructured, the cognitively lethal. It evokes space, yes, but space that should not be approached. Writers facing the impossible often adopt architectural language as a surrogate. Dimensions are framed through angles, vaults, arches, or planes, terms that allow the author to speak spatially without claiming full knowledge. In The Call of Cthulhu, the city of R'lyeh is described using phrases like an angle which was acute, but behaved as if it were obtuse. Such contradictions are not poetic flourishes. They signal conceptual rupture. Lovecraft uses mathematical terms not to clarify, but to signal the reader's arrival at the edge of comprehension. Geometry is not aesthetic here. It is epistemic. The breakdown of spatial description mirrors the breakdown of thought. This linguistic instability finds reinforcement in narrative modifiers that warn rather than explain. Adjectives like cyclopean, non-Euclidean, and Eldritch appear again and again in cosmic horror, not to describe with precision, but to shield the text from full depiction. They function like radiation symbols, recognizable but unapproachable. Their repetition creates an aura of consistency, but not content. Readers believe in the underlying coherence of the world because the language avoids specifics. In this way, symbolic language serves a double purpose. It creates continuity across stories while simultaneously ensuring no stable image ever forms. Language also functions metaphorically through recurring spatial motifs. Three in particular dominate: the threshold, the fold, and the gulf. The threshold suggests a dangerous crossing, where dimensions intersect briefly. The fold implies layered realities that occasionally brush against each other. The gulf names the terrifying distance between realities or minds. These terms carry cultural weight: thresholds as ritual spaces, folds as metaphysical riddles, gulfs as theological voids. But in cosmic horror, they become tools for expressing the non-narratability of certain places. One does not travel through these spaces. One is disassembled by contact with them. Consider the dimension not as a world, but as a limit on language itself. Writers like Thomas Ligotti and Caitlin R. Kiernan continue this tradition by emphasizing what cannot be said. Kiernan often uses repetition and negation to approximate the linguistic collapse that follows dimensional intrusion. Her narrators drift into spirals of abstraction. It was not here, but not elsewhere either, echoing Lovecraft's evasive tendencies. This is not lack of craft. It is the intentional cultivation of semantic breakdown. The horror lies in the realization that the tools we use to make sense of space, nouns, coordinates, images, have already failed before the first sentence ends. Even typographical choices can reinforce this collapse. In modern transmedia horror, SCP entries, creepypasta archives, found document narratives, dimensions are often referred to through redactions, corrupted files, or broken syntax. These techniques borrow from bureaucratic or scientific genres to create false precision. A file might describe spatial layer 8A null, or reference topography class 03. These invented systems mimic knowledge while preserving its impossibility. The horror emerges not from the content, but from the aesthetic of knowing without comprehension. Language wears the mask of science while gesturing toward an anti-scientific void. This linguistic strategy creates an unusual form of authenticity. Readers are drawn in not because they understand, but because they recognize their own confusion within the text. This recognition breeds trust. It feels real precisely because it does not resolve. We must pause here. In cosmic horror, the failure of language does not weaken the illusion. It deepens it. The dimension becomes believable not through description, but through structured evasion. From here, the question intensifies. If writers cannot describe these spaces directly, how do they convince us they are real? The answer lies in the architecture of myth. In the next section, we will examine how authors use narrative fragmentation, testimonial layering, and faux documentary techniques to give impossible dimensions the weight of lived history. Cosmic horror achieves its unsettling realism not by explaining its dimensions, but by implying that they have always been there. The sense of authenticity in these impossible spaces does not come from world building in the fantasy sense, geography, flora, customs, but from something closer to archaeological myth-making. What makes these dimensions convincing is that they are never introduced directly. Instead, they are remembered, cited, whispered about, or misrecorded. Their reality emerges through accumulation, not exposition. Lovecraft's technique relies heavily on fragmented testimony. He often frames his stories as recovered accounts, journal entries, newspaper clippings, ship logs, dreams retold under duress. In The Call of Cthulhu, 1928, we never see Relia directly. Instead, we piece it together from scattered sources. A dead sculptor's visions, an Arctic discovery, the ravings of a sailor. The result is a layered narrative in which the reader becomes a kind of investigator, assembling the idea of the dimension from unreliable fragments. The cumulative weight of these distortions makes the dimension feel older than the narrative itself. The reader is not learning, they are uncovering. This process mirrors the structure of cultural myth. Ancient myths were not consumed as authored texts, but inherited as sediment, layers of tale, ritual, and fragment. Cosmic horror mimics this form. The Necronomicon, for instance, is never quoted at length. It is always partially seen, inconsistently translated, or paraphrased through secondhand sources. Its origin is both specific, the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred, and deliberately unverifiable. This duality gives it mythic resonance. The book becomes a dimensional vector, not a map, but a wound through which forbidden space leaks. It has no fixed content, only function, to evoke a space where content fails. Writers also embed false systems of knowledge to reinforce the illusion. Invented cosmologies, such as Derleth's elemental Great Old Ones schema, or later expansions like the Dreamlands cartography, suggest a coherent underlying structure without ever fully revealing it. These systems are filled with internal inconsistencies, but they feel real because they echo the messiness of real-world mythology. Compare this to religious apocrypha, where contradictions coexist with conviction. The presence of disagreement does not weaken belief. It authenticates it by suggesting interpretive history. The dimension becomes real, not because it is described in detail, but because its descriptions are debated. A key technique is narrative restraint. The more horrific the dimension, the less directly it is shown. Through the Gates of the Silver Key, 1934, allows Randolph Carter to glimpse higher dimensional space, but the story carefully avoids concrete detail. The narrator retreats into metaphor, distancing the reader from the full vision. A chaos of forms and entities without logic or order. This is not vagueness. It is an aesthetic of evasion, a way of signaling that the narrator has reached the edge of communicable experience. Such restraint cultivates authenticity. Readers believe because the text does not pretend to fully know. The narrator is witness, not guide. Importantly, these stories avoid closure. Even when dimensions are accessed via dreams, rituals, geometry, the result is rarely insight. It is confusion, madness, or disappearance. The character does not return with a map. They vanish, or they speak in fragments. This narrative structure mimics real-world accounts of anomalous experience, from religious visions to alien abductions. The lack of internal logic mirrors the structure of belief, not explanation. In this way, fictional dimensions borrow the tone of oral tradition, conspiracy, and religious mysticism. They are not explained within the story because they are not explainable within the world view of the speaker. Consider this carefully. Cosmic horror dimensions feel discovered, not invented, because the reader is placed in the position of the latecomer, always too late to intervene, always gathering from the wreckage. The story is never about encountering the dimension first. It is about encountering its traces. Something happened. Something was seen. But by the time we arrive, it has already passed through and left damage behind. This approach leads naturally to the next phase of inquiry. Now that we have traced the cultural and linguistic strategies that give these dimensions their eerie realism, we must ask what they actually mean. What philosophical themes do these spaces embody? What concepts, insignificance, entropy, unreality, emerge from contact with them? In Part 2, we turn from origins to nature, from the building of the idea to the conceptual threats it carries. The most horrifying dimensions in cosmic horror do not simply house monsters. They expose concepts the human mind was not shaped to grasp. At their core lie three recurring philosophical disruptions: insignificance, entropy, and the unreliability of reality itself. These are not just themes, but destabilizing forces. Each undermines a core human assumption, purpose, permanence, perception, and replaces it with something older, larger, and entirely indifferent. The horror is not that these forces exist, but that we ever believed they didn't. Insignificance is the axis upon which the cosmic horror worldview turns. In Lovecraft's 1926 letter to Farnsworth Wright, he wrote, "All my tales are based on the fundamental premise that common human laws and interests and emotions have no validity or significance in the vast cosmos." Dimensional horror enforces this by demonstrating that not only are humans unimportant, space itself is structured without reference to them. In The Color Out of Space, 1927, the invading force is not malicious. It is simply incompatible. Its origin is not hell or heaven, but a direction beyond. The blasted landscape it leaves behind is not cursed. It is irrelevant to the logic of survival. Entropy, in this context, is not decay alone. It is structural collapse. In many of these dimensions, laws do not erode. They never applied to begin with. Consider the realm glimpsed in Through the Gates of the Silver Key, 1934, where time ceases to operate linearly and identity fragments into parallel versions. This is not a dream, but a thermodynamic nightmare. The protagonist cannot retain form or will. The universe does not forget him. It never noticed him at all. These dimensions evoke entropy not as physical degradation, but as epistemological failure. Knowledge acquired within one dimension decomposes when moved into another. Equally destabilizing is the idea that reality may be conditional, unstable, or false. Dreamlike dimensions often appear throughout Lovecraft's work and its successors, but the horror is not in dreaming. It is in the uncertainty that one has ever been awake. In The Dreams in the Witch House, 1933, Walter Gilman is pulled into a dimension governed by alien geometry and sound-based navigation. His efforts to map his experience fail as reality shifts beneath his feet. The dimension does not operate by physical laws. It operates by dream logic, where symbol replaces structure. But this dream does not end. In fact, its continuity suggests the waking world may be the illusion. We must pause here. These dimensions are not merely narrative devices. They are philosophical arguments disguised as locations. To enter one is to accept a metaphysical risk, the unraveling of one's assumptions about what existence entails. They do not simply say, "You are small." They say, "The concept of scale itself is local to your dimension and meaningless here." Time, matter, and even causality are shown to be dimensional conveniences, not cosmic absolutes. Other authors expand this collapse. Thomas Ligotti's work frequently imagines dimensions that do not defy reality, but replace it with something thinner. In The Shadow at the Bottom of the World, the encroaching presence is not an entity, but a shift in the nature of presence itself. Plants move without cause. Time loops unnaturally. Language degrades. The characters do not confront evil. They experience the waning of narrative structure. The world becomes aesthetic without logic, like a dream that continues after the dreamer dies. Ligotti suggests a world where reality persists only out of habit, and those habits are wearing thin. These dimensions present not horror in the traditional sense, fear of pain or death, but philosophical vertigo. The reader is invited to contemplate their place in a universe that never made a place for them. This is horror stripped of malice, morality, or resolution. It is not God's judgment, nor fate's cruelty. It is the discovery that the frame of reference itself was temporary. The human mind, so quick to anchor meaning in story and law, finds itself adrift in frameworks that cannot accommodate story at all. The next section explores what populates these impossible dimensions. If space is hostile, not because of intention, but because of structure, then what forms of being could arise there? Are the so-called gods of the mythos native to these dimensional voids? Are they aware of us, or are we the byproduct of their movement? We now turn from concept to presence, from what dimensions mean to what they contain. To describe the inhabitants of horrifying dimensions is to risk misrepresentation. These entities are not monsters in the traditional sense. They are not predators, nor villains, nor metaphors. They are expressions of incompatible order, beings whose very existence implies that our universe is structurally incomplete. In many cases, their presence is incidental. The horror does not arise because they seek us out. It arises because they exist at all. Consider Yog-Sothoth, first mentioned in the case of Charles Dexter Ward, written 1927. He is described as coexistent with all time and space. He is not merely in multiple places. He is the dimensional totality. Theosophically, he occupies the position of both map and terrain. The narrator of the Dunwich Horror, a 1929, offers a fearful phrase. Yog-Sothoth knows the gate. Yog-Sothoth is the gate. This is not metaphor. It is a failed attempt to describe an entity for whom dimensional boundaries are irrelevant. To speak of Yog-Sothoth in spatial terms is already an error. Azathoth presents a different kind of dimensional terror. His court exists at the center of ultimate chaos, but this center defies physics. It is not a coordinate, it is a negation. The god's mindless writhing, accompanied by the monotonous piping of flutes, represents a realm where consciousness has no place. Nothing about Azathoth suggests malice. He is not awake. His dreaming is the universe. the dimension he occupies is one in which thought, value, and coherence dissolve into repetition. His presence answers a question cosmic horror quietly asks. What if the final cause of reality is neither benevolent nor intelligent, but simply unaware? Other entities reveal the structural strangeness of their native dimensions through their form. The Migo in The Whisperer in Darkness, 1931, are not evil. They are described as fungus crab hybrids who extract human brains for transport through space. Yet their true nature lies not in biology, but in dimensional access. Their wings do not function in Earth's atmosphere. They function in the ether, which, in Lovecraft's metaphysics, is a medium of unseen geometries. Their interaction with humans is clinical, not cruel. Their horror lies in the casual ease with which they bypass dimensional constraints we consider absolute. Dreamland beings occupy a liminal position. In The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, 1926, Randolph Carter navigates realms where gods and beasts coexist with human-like civilizations. But these regions obey rules of dream logic, inconsistent scale, mutable form, time that loops or stalls. The gods of these spaces, Nyarlathotep, chief among them, serve as bridges between dimensions, both emissary and trickster. Nyarlathotep alone walks freely across realms, assuming forms and dialects as needed. He is not confined to madness or mass. He mimics understanding without ever yielding it. Through him, Lovecraft introduces the possibility that some beings are not beyond comprehension, but worse, deliberately comprehensible only in part. Importantly, many of these entities do not live in their dimensions. They are their dimensions, or rather, they express dimensional frameworks. Shub-Niggurath, the black goat of the woods with 1,000 young, is often invoked but rarely seen. Her offspring infiltrates space, but her form remains ambient, reproductive, ecological. She may represent a dimension of biological excess, where form is unbounded and replication is continuous. This kind of being defies discrete embodiment. It is not an individual, but a dimensional function with attributes. It acts, not with will, but with inevitability. Later mythos writers expand this taxonomy. Laird Barron's work introduces entities that exist behind perception, cosmic forces that do not interact with matter directly, but operate through influence and presence. In the Imago sequence, an image functions as a dimensional vector. To see it is to be altered. The entities involved do not enter our world, they tilt it. Others, like those in Caitlin R. Kiernan's fiction, are perceptible only through their effects. Spatial distortion, time loops, the sudden failure of linguistic reference. Their power is not in action, but in structural interference. The significance of these beings lies not in their behavior, but in their ontological insult. They do not simply threaten human life. They reveal that human thought is built on local rules, and those rules are not universal. When they appear, it is not as visitors, but as reassertions of cosmic structure. They do not see us. They do not need to. Their presence reveals us to be temporary phenomena, caught in a frame we mistook for reality. The next section explores what happens when humans come too close. If these entities represent incompatible systems, what occurs when a human mind confronts one? How does interaction collapse the self? In 2.3, we examine the role of madness, not as a cliché, but as the only possible outcome of contact with a universe not shaped for our survival. In cosmic horror, madness is not a narrative punishment. It is a diagnostic outcome. When humans encounter horrifying dimensions, their minds do not break because they are weak, sinful, or curious. They break because cognition evolved under assumptions those dimensions invalidate. The human mind presumes continuity, scale, and causality. Dimensional horror removes all three at once. What follows is not insanity in the clinical sense, but cognitive overload. A system attempting to process inputs it was never designed to receive. Lovecraft consistently frames madness as a failure of translation. Characters do not go mad because they see something frightening. They go mad because they see something that cannot be reconciled with prior knowledge. In The Call of Cthulhu, Inspector Legrasse's witnesses offer fragmented descriptions of Relia's geometry, repeating phrases without comprehension. One cultist mutters of angles which were acute but behaved as if obtuse. This is not metaphor. It is a report of perception collapsing under contradiction. The mind attempts to impose Euclidean logic where none applies and fractures. In the attempt, we must pause here. Madness and cosmic horror is not the opposite of knowledge. It is its consequence. In At the Mountains of Madness, 1936, Dyer survives his encounter with the Antarctic city, but survival comes at a cost. He understands too much. His warnings are calm, rational, and urgent, yet they are ignored because they exceed what institutions can accept. The horror lies in this inversion. Sanity becomes socially unintelligible once it incorporates dimensional truth. Madness functions here as a social label, applied when understanding diverges too far from consensus reality. Dream-based dimensions intensify this effect by eroding the boundary between perception and identity. In The Dreams in the Witch House, Walter Gilman does not merely observe alien spaces, he inhabits them. His dreams follow mathematical pathways, and his waking life deteriorates accordingly. Sleep becomes a vector of exposure. The result is not fear, but dissociation. Gilman's mind begins to treat incompatible frameworks as equally valid. This produces a fractured self, capable of navigating neither world fully. Madness here is failed adaptation, not emotional collapse. Other authors sharpen this function. Algernon Blackwood's The Willows, 1907, predates Lovecraft, yet establishes a similar pattern. The protagonists do not encounter a visible entity. They sense a shift in spatial authority. The riverbanks feel wrong. Distances distort. Sound carries incorrectly. Their fear arises not from threat, but from the realization that place itself has agency. The men remain lucid, but their interpretations fail. They experience what later writers would formalize as ontological anxiety, the fear that reality's rules are conditional. Cosmic horror repeatedly returns to the idea that madness is misaligned sanity. Cultists, for instance, often appear functional within their own frameworks. They interpret visions correctly, but draw catastrophic conclusions. In The Shadow Over, Innsmouth, 1931, the narrator's transformation is framed not as tragedy, but as acceptance. His former horror gives way to calm once his identity realigns with a non-human lineage. This is not redemption. It is cognitive surrender. He becomes sane only by abandoning the human frame entirely. Not insanity, but reclassification. Modern cosmic horror continues this trajectory. In Thomas Ligotti's work, madness often manifests as clarity stripped of comfort. Characters realize that meaning is a psychological prosthesis, not a cosmic guarantee. In The Red Tower, observation itself becomes corrosive. To understand the structure of the tower is to lose the ability to situate oneself within reality. The reader is not shown the tower. They are shown the effects of understanding it. Madness functions as negative capability. the inability to unknow what has been learned. This suggests a grim conclusion. Human interaction with horrifying dimensions does not produce heroes, survivors, or prophets. It produces witnesses without authority. Their accounts are dismissed, fragmented, or absorbed into myth. Madness, then, is not failure, but evidence. It signals that contact occurred. It is the mind's scar tissue, marking where incompatible structures touched. The next question follows inevitably. If madness is the cost of contact, why do characters persist in seeking these dimensions? What compels them to read forbidden texts, follow dreams, or open gates they know will not close? In the next section, we examine forbidden knowledge itself, not as temptation, but as an epistemic collapse that makes ignorance impossible once certain questions are asked. In cosmic horror, knowledge is not power, it is contamination. To learn too much about horrifying dimensions is not to gain advantage, it is to forfeit the very framework by which meaning operates. These dimensions do not conceal themselves with secrets. They are hidden only by the limitations of perception. Once accessed through ritual, dream, mathematics, or chance, they unwrite the rules that made knowledge coherent in the first place. The result is not enlightenment, but epistemic collapse, the disintegration of the systems that allow us to know anything at all. Forbidden knowledge in cosmic horror is not defined by content, it is defined by effect. In the Necronomicon, that most iconic fictional tome, the danger is not in reading specific passages, but in comprehending just enough to destabilize reality. The book's descriptions of ancient beings and alternate geometries introduce new frames of reference that cannot coexist with conventional logic. Its recurring presence across Lovecraft's stories suggests a paradox. The more it reveals, the less the reader can trust their own interpretations. It is a manual for cognitive malfunction. This effect is not limited to ancient texts. In From Beyond, 1934, a machine stimulates the pineal gland, allowing perception of coexisting entities. The horror is immediate and irreversible. The characters do not gain secret wisdom. They gain access to a layer of reality they cannot ignore or survive. Knowledge becomes a permanent wound in perception. The danger lies not in what is seen, but in the impossibility of unseeing. This is the essence of epistemic collapse, not death, but a life lived under the shadow of incompatible truths. Consider this carefully. Forbidden knowledge does not function like a puzzle in these stories. There is no correct interpretation, no solution waiting at the end. The closer characters come to understanding, the more the framework itself fails. In the music of Eric Zahn, 1922, the protagonist attempts to locate a window that reveals something outside of time and space. He is ultimately denied the full vision, but the effort itself warps his experience of the world. The loss of knowledge becomes preferable to its completion. Not mystery, but anti-closure preserves the mind. Mathematics and science are not exempt. In The Dreams in the Witch House, the protagonist's study of multidimensional geometry serves as a portal, not because he miscalculates, but because he calculates correctly. His equations don't fail, they function, and in functioning, they connect him to a space the mind cannot host. This suggests a chilling corollary. Some forms of knowledge are dangerous not because they are false, but because they are true in a context we are not adapted to inhabit. Later writers extend this theme into media itself. In the SCP Foundation's mythos, exposure to dimensional anomalies often corrupts language, logic, or digital systems. SCP-3930, for instance, describes a location that does not exist, but still occupies space, affects memory, and kills those who perceive it. Personnel are instructed to repeat SCP-3930 does not exist, even while observing it. This contradiction generates a localized epistemic collapse, a situation in which the act of knowing both affirms and negates its object. The mind becomes caught in a loop it cannot exit. These stories consistently reject the Enlightenment ideal that all knowledge is progress. In cosmic horror, knowledge is a zone of exposure. To know is to be seen. To investigate is to participate. And to understand is to be transformed into something that no longer belongs to this world. This marks a fundamental reversal of the Promethean myth. Here, the fire of knowledge does not liberate. It burns away the self that once sought it. Forbidden knowledge thus functions not as a warning, but as a boundary, one that, once crossed, changes the meaning of truth itself. Readers are not spared. The structure of these stories often implicates the audience. We read partial translations of blasphemous texts, overhear second-hand rituals, glimpse names never meant to be spoken. Every page is an act of trespass, and every revelation, however veiled, pushes us closer to the edge of what the human mind can safely hold. With this, the central philosophical arc of horrifying dimensions comes into focus. These are not places to visit, but realities that undo the conditions of being human. They do not kill, they rearrange, and in their presence, thought itself becomes suspect. In the next part of our investigation, we turn from ideas to text. How have these dimensions manifested in literature itself? What stories first gave them form, and what narrative strategies allowed authors to suggest spaces beyond comprehension without ever fully showing them? We now descend into literary history to examine the earliest sightings of impossible space. The earliest glimpses of horrifying dimensions in cosmic horror do not announce themselves as such. They emerge through narrative stress points, moments when story, character, or language fails to contain what has been perceived. In these early texts, the dimension is rarely the setting. It is a side effect, a byproduct of revelation. The reader does not visit these spaces directly. They infer them from the damage they leave behind, on minds, landscapes, and sentences. The Call of Cthulhu, 1928, provides the first systematic appearance of impossible space. The sunken city of Relayea is not described in detail, yet its geometry remains central. An angle which was acute but behaved as if it were obtuse. This is not visual description. It is perceptual contradiction. The dimension leaks into physical space, causing cognitive contradiction rather than sensory horror. The narrative scaffolding, ship logs, dreams, secondhand accounts, prevents direct contact, preserving ambiguity while hinting at deep structure. This strategy becomes a hallmark of dimensional horror. Imply architecture, describe its effect, never stabilize its form. In The Dreams in the Witch House, 1933, the dimensional breach is personal. Walter Gilman's experiences are framed through dreams, but he is a student of mathematics, not mysticism. His exposure to non-Euclidean geometry and quantum physics allows him to unconsciously navigate a space where the walls of space and time had temporarily lost their rigidity. The dream dimension he visits defies moral and physical law, featuring Brown Jenkin, a rat-faced familiar, and Keziah Mason, a witch who travels by formula rather than broomstick. Here, the horror stems not from chaos, but precision in the wrong direction. The protagonist doesn't merely imagine the dimension, he calculates his way into it. This rational entry reframes madness as a natural response to truth, These dimensions are interconnected not by coordinates, but by effect and implication. R'lyeh, the Silver Key realms, and the Witch House's hyperdimensional grid do not form a coherent map, yet each introduces patterns: distortion of time, failure of perception, irreversible transformation. This echoes the structure of mythic space, where symbolic consistency substitutes for physical continuity. The reader is trained to recognize dimensional interference not by description, but by symptomology. Language fragments, identity dissolves, geometry contradicts itself. Over time, these symptoms become diagnostic tools within the mythos. The Silver Key stories, especially Through the Gates of the Silver Key, 1934, formalize the dimensional motif into overt metaphysics. Randolph Carter passes through a portal that obliterates not only time and space, but identity. He becomes a composite consciousness spread across multiple forms, witnessing the endless vistas of the ultimate abyss, black, impersonal gulfs beyond space and time, and unthinkable rotations of hypermatter. This is not dream nor vision. It is ontological estrangement. Carter ceases to be a character in a story and becomes a vessel for dimensional plurality. The narrative bends to accommodate his transformation, switching from first person to omniscient as his individuality erodes. In this moment, the dimension is not just setting or event, it becomes a narrative agent, forcing formal distortion. These early stories also share aesthetic strategies. Key among them is the partial artifact, manuscripts, letters, and ancient carvings that point toward knowledge just out of reach. In The Nameless City, 1921, the narrator finds crypts and murals depicting an alien race and their underworld metropolis. The city itself is not spatially anomalous, but its influence induces a sense of spatial reverberation. The narrator becomes convinced that space has a haunting and terrible familiarity, even as nothing concrete is revealed. These early uses of dimensional horror often rely not on visual spectacle, but on semantic discomfort. The reader senses that the narrator cannot accurately describe what has been seen, and that the gap is intentional. Crucially, these texts lay the groundwork for a non-systematized mythos. Unlike Tolkien's coherent world-building, Lovecraft's universe evolves by accretion and resonance. Each story adds new terminology, Yog-Sothoth, Leng, Kadath, but does not stabilize the cosmology. The shared universe remains open-ended, suggestive. The dimensionality across these stories is consistent not in location, but in function, to reveal that reality is locally stable, but cosmically unstable. This early period sets the tone for all that follows. Horror no longer stems from death or evil, but from contact with the structural outside. These dimensions are not elsewhere. They are beneath, behind, or within, accessible only when the wrong ritual is spoken or the wrong theorem is solved. The stories do not merely imagine monsters in space. They ask, what if space is the monster? In the next two sections, we will examine how this literary model is refined and expanded. First, through a focused analysis of a single-dimensional narrative. Then, by tracing its transformation across a contrasting example, where language, setting, and self all disintegrate under exposure. Lovecraft's The Dreams in the Witch House, 1933, stands as a critical case in dimensional horror, not because it is the most famous, but because it articulates a rare fusion of science and superstition. It is one of the few stories where the protagonist's descent into an impossible space is both dreamlike and mathematically justified. Here, the dimension is not only a metaphor for madness, It is a structure that emerges from thought itself, then overwrites the thinker. Walter Gilman, the story's protagonist, is a student of mathematics and folklore. His dual engagement with non-Euclidean geometry and New England witchcraft places him at the intersection of rationality and myth. The attic room he rents is situated in Arkham's oldest house, an architectural relic where every angle was slightly wrong. That phrase is not descriptive flair, it is a signal. Gilman's room is not a room. It is a dimensional conduit, a misaligned structure that weakens the boundary between realities. He dreams, but the dreams are navigational. He moves across angled corridors, which seemed somehow outside the three dimensions we know. His journeys are not symbolic. They are topological errors made manifest. The story's brilliance lies in how it presents the dimension as accessible only to the wrong kind of mind. Gilman does not arrive through ritual. He arrives through calculation. His academic work primes his perception to notice hidden geometries others overlook. Lovecraft uses this mechanism to reframe curiosity as a liability. The more accurate Gilman's theorems become, the more permeable his reality becomes. We are told that he stares at diagrams until they begin to curve and twist themselves into grotesque, impossible shapes. This is not mental instability. It is mathematics behaving too well, revealing what lies beyond the visible. Inside the dimension, Gilman encounters Kezia Mason, a 17th century witch who vanished during the Salem trials after scribbling equations on her cell wall. She is accompanied by Brown Jenkin, a rat with a human face. These figures are grotesque, not because of their appearance, but because they maintain consistency across dream and waking life. Their presence confirms the dimension's intrusion into consensus reality. More disturbingly, they do not threaten Gilman directly. They use him. The dimension exerts pressure on him to participate in a ritual involving the sacrifice of a human child. His resistance weakens as spatial and moral boundaries erode in tandem. Here, the dimension functions narratively as the erasure of personal agency. Gilman does not choose to cross over. He is absorbed. The dimension flattens the distinction between thought and space, between waking and dreaming. Even death offers no escape. In the story's final pages, long after Gilman's corpse has been found, the narrator reveals that other tenants have heard inexplicable scuttling in the walls. Tzadats. Breach has not closed. The spatial wrongness persists. This story also introduces a structural motif that will recur in later dimensional horror, the unstable threshold. Gilman's room operates like a sensitive membrane between dimensions. It is architectural, but not spatially fixed. Others who sleep there do not experience the same effects, suggesting that the dimension does not open to places, but to types of thought. Later authors will build on this idea, that dimensional access is personalized, psychically tuned, and irreversible. The broader mythos is also reinforced. Keziah's equations reference the Black Man, a euphemism for Nyarlathotep, who appears here as a facilitator of dimensional travel. His presence signals not guidance, but structural authority. He does not explain. He permits passage. Through this figure, Lovecraft hints that the universe is not empty, but governed by intelligences whose goals are indifferent to human comprehension. The horror is not in Nyarlathotep's actions. It is in the fact that his involvement makes dimensional instability permanent. In the dreams in the witch house, Lovecraft crafts a dimension that is neither allegorical nor otherworldly. It is a logical extension of human inquiry, one that punishes perception with access. The horror comes not from crossing into another place, but from realizing that the crossing already occurred and that it was invited by understanding. The story remains a foundational text, not because of what it shows, but because of what it proves. That horrifying dimensions are not distant. They are mathematically adjacent to our own. In the next section, we will explore a contrasting case. Where Gilman's descent is gradual and mental, the next protagonist encounters dimensional collapse without transition, a world where space itself betrays meaning instantly, and where the reader, like the character, is left grasping for a narrative that will not resolve. William Hope Hodgson's The House on the Borderland, 1908, predates Lovecraft, yet it articulates a form of dimensional horror that anticipates and arguably deepens the cosmic tradition. Unlike the dreams in the witch house, which slowly erodes the protagonist's reality through logic and dream convergence, The House on the Borderland presents its horrifying dimension all at once as a rupture in time, space, and self. There is no preparatory descent. The protagonist opens a diary and falls directly into a reality that refuses to stabilize. The story is framed as a found manuscript, a familiar device later used by Lovecraft and others to preserve ambiguity. Two travelers in rural Ireland discover the journal of an unnamed recluse living in a crumbling house. His diary begins conventionally, but soon reveals incursions by humanoid swine things and visions of alien landscapes. The recluse describes one such transition. It seemed I floated miles above the world, and then, in a moment, the earth dropped away, and I was moving forward into the blackness of space. The shift is not metaphorical. The house itself, and the dimension it touches, becomes the locus of an impossible journey. This journey escalates not into chaos, but into cosmic order so vast it erases meaning. The recluse witnesses the death of the solar system, the collapse of stars, and the end of time. This vision is presented without traditional plot mechanics. There is no machine, no ritual, no summoning. The dimension is encountered because the house permits it, or because the recluse's perception has detached from temporal law. His descriptions carry a tone of awe, not fear. I saw the green sun sink slowly behind a huge mountain chain. A chill seemed to creep into my bones. The horror is existential, not situational. The universe is not hostile, it is unreachable. Unlike Gilman in Witch House, the recluse does not experience his body as violated. It is his context that dissolves. Space dilates into abstraction. Time accelerates. He sees the house crumble and rebuild. Civilizations rise and fall, all while seated in the same chair. Hodgson uses this collapse to suggest that the horrifying dimension is not another realm, but a wider frame of perception. The recluse does not travel. He perceives too much. This transforms the story from a haunting into a dimensional confrontation with deep time, one that refuses narrative closure. Importantly, the recluse does not go mad in the Lovecraftian sense. His journal remains legible, detailed, reflective. His failure is not mental breakdown, but failure of integration. He cannot reconcile what he has seen with any available language. In this, Hodgson anticipates a key feature of later dimensional horror, the idea that sanity may persist while interpretive frameworks fail. The recluse remains lucid, but lucidity is inadequate. What he sees exceeds narrative itself, not just human reason. This theme continues in the description of the plane of silence, a dimension of stillness and isolation that defies categorization. There was no sound, not even the rustle of a wind. The trees were stone still. This quiet is not peaceful. It is ontologically wrong. The absence of entropy, the suspension of motion, produces not serenity, but dread. The recluse cannot determine if time has stopped, or if he has entered a realm where cause and effect have no relevance. Space behaves like dream, but without symbolism. The dimension is not allegorical. It is bare experience stripped of human reference points. The house itself functions as both anchor and interface. It is not magical. It is spatially misaligned, a rupture point where dimensions brush against each other. The swine things represent biological intrusion, life forms from another reality, but they are secondary to the broader horror. They can be fought. What cannot be fought is the expansion of awareness, the irreversible realization that the universe contains structures the mind cannot hold. Unlike later stories where the dimensional breach must be opened, here it simply exists, patient, permanent, waiting for attention to drift. Hodgson's contribution to dimensional horror is often under-recognized, yet in The House on the Borderland, he develops ideas that would shape the genre's philosophical core. There is no theology, no villainy, no salvation. The horrifying dimension is horrifying precisely because it is true. Its laws are not malicious. They are simply not ours. The recluse survives, but nothing in his world remains interpretable. The final image is of collapse, not of space, but of story as a stable medium. This story contrasts powerfully with the dreams in the witch house. Gilman is undone by a rational progression. The recluse is undone by abrupt exposure. One enters the dimension through intellect, the other through proximity. In both cases, the end is the same. Not death, but displacement from meaning. In the next section, we explore how later writers and collaborators took these foundations and extended them, sometimes with reverence, sometimes with systems, and occasionally with clarifications that risked defanging the very dread they inherited. After Lovecraft's death in 1937, the mythos of horrifying dimensions passed into many hands. Some, like August Derleth, sought to systematize it. Others, like Ramsey Campbell, expanded its psychological ambiguity. Across the decades, a recurring tension emerged. Can the indescribable remain effective once too clearly described? The answer, increasingly, depends not on fidelity to Lovecraft's details, but on fidelity to his method of implication. Where the early text suggested, later expansions often defined, and in doing so, risked converting cosmic horror into taxonomy. August Derleth was the first to formalize the mythos. He introduced a rigid framework of elemental forces, aligning beings with earth, air, fire, and water. He reinterpreted Yog-Sothoth and Azathoth not as chaotic presences, but as members of a moral binary, elder gods versus great old ones. This structure imposed purpose where none had existed, turning dimensions from indifferent realities into battlefields. Azathoth became a symbol of chaos, Nodens of order. While this clarified the cosmology, it also diminished the existential ambiguity that made the original dimensions terrifying. Under Derleth's influence, readers no longer feared the unknowable. They feared the evil. Other writers resisted this simplification. Ramsey Campbell, writing in the 1960s and 70s, relocated the mythos to the crumbling industrial towns of England. His dimensions are subtle, hints of other spaces bleeding into mundane reality. In The Inhabitant of the Lake, 1964, the titular entity is barely glimpsed. The horror lies in what space becomes under its influence. Distorted geography, decaying architecture, time loops. Campbell preserves Lovecraft's technique of showing dimensionality through environmental damage, not exposition. His beings do not explain. They remain friction points in space, entities whose dimensional provenance is only ever inferred through ruin. In the 1980s and beyond, authors like Brian Lumley and Lynn Carter attempted further expansions. Lumley's Titus Crow series turned the mythos into a kind of occult science fiction. Dimensions were mapped, traversed, and sometimes even escaped. The crawling chaos became a target, not an enigma. Readers followed protagonists across realms using time clocks and psychic battles. While entertaining, these expansions often treated dimensions as stages for adventure rather than existential rupture. The horror became manageable, navigable by those with the right tools. This shift marked a genre drift from cosmic horror into dimensional fantasy. By contrast, authors like Thomas Ligotti and Caitlin R. Kiernan reinstated the unknowable. Ligotti's dimensions rarely take shape at all. They are felt rather than seen, emanations of mental illness, architecture, and perception. In Nethyscurial, a god is revealed to pervade reality itself, corrupting not space, but the concept of space. Kiernan's work pushes further. In Houses Under the Sea and The Ape's Wife, dimensions manifest through linguistic instability, unresolvable narratives, and temporal spirals. Characters do not enter other realms. They realize they are already within them, and that their perception was the final barrier. In these works, dimensional horror becomes an ontological infection. Transmedia horror has also embraced and mutated these ideas. The SCP Foundation, an online collaborative fiction project, features hundreds of entries involving spatial anomalies. SCP-106 dwells in a pocket dimension of corrosion and rot. SCP-Irjo-93 opens mirrors into alternate Earths. SCP-3001 is a void where a lone scientist slowly disintegrates over decades. These entries succeed when they maintain narrative restraint, suggesting dimensional interference through logs, redacted files, and corrupted data. But as with earlier expansions, excessive systematization occasionally undercuts the effect. A horror becomes less terrifying when it is filed, classified, and given a number. This mirrors a broader pattern: the danger of mapping too precisely what was meant to remain uncertain. Cosmic horror relies on an unresolved tension between story and space. The moment the dimension becomes navigable, it ceases to be horrifying. This is not a failure of creativity. It is a byproduct of expansion. Every mythos, once adopted by many hands, tends toward coherence, and coherence is the one thing horrifying dimensions cannot survive. Yet the genre has adapted. In contemporary fiction, film, and interactive media, writers are increasingly returning to ambiguity. Found footage films like The Blair Witch Project or The Outwaters use dimensional rupture not as a twist, but as an explanatory failure. Video games like Control and Anatomy explore architecture as unstable, space as interpretive. These works inherit the early insight that terrifying dimensions are most effective not when seen, but when they make the act of seeing impossible. In closing this section, we see that the evolution of dimensional horror reflects a deeper narrative paradox. To tell a story about an impossible space, one must never fully reveal the space. The moment it is explained, it is tamed. The true horror is not the dimension itself, but what happens to narrative, identity, and perception when the story enters a space it was never built to hold. Next, we turn to the world beyond fiction, to sightings, hoaxes, and myths, where horrifying dimensions appear not as literary devices, but as things people claim to have seen, entered, or never fully returned from. The boundary between story and belief is thinner than we think. Long after the original stories faded into cult shelves, the concept of horrifying dimensions found new life, not through fiction, but through rumor. From YouTube rabbit holes to Reddit threads, the past 2 decades have seen a proliferation of alleged encounters with places that defy space and time. These aren't framed as stories, but as experiences: liminal stairwells, infinite parking garages, disappearing roads, described in language not far from Lovecraft's, but now divorced from literary framing. The result is a strange cultural phenomenon, dimensional horror that no longer requires authorship. It circulates as digital folklore. The most prominent example is the Backrooms, a viral urban legend born from a 2019 4chan post. Described as an endless maze of randomly generated office rooms, the Backrooms are yellow-lit, low-ceilinged, and empty, liminal space made infinite. One does not choose to enter them. One no-clips through reality. The concept spread rapidly through creepypasta, YouTube series, and video games. Importantly, there is no monster at the core. The horror lies in the spatial infinity itself, and the realization that escape is unlikely, because there was no entry point to begin with. This aligns directly with cosmic horror's core: space as an uncaring, recursive structure. Another recurring motif is the staircase in the woods phenomenon. First reported anonymously by a supposed search and rescue officer, the tale describes isolated staircases found deep in forests, leading nowhere, often untouched by decay. Though likely fictional, the account spread across forums like Reddit's r/no-sleep and r/creepypasta. These staircases are unsettling, not because they do anything, but because they don't belong. They echo Lovecraft's Ar-Liye or Hodgson's Borderland house, architectural anomalies that imply dimensional instability. They function as spatial intrusions, evidence, not explanation. Real-world places have also been retrofitted into dimensional myth. The Dyatlov Pass incident, 1959, is often cited in forums as a possible case of dimensional rift. Experienced hikers found dead under bizarre circumstances, some with missing eyes and tongues, with their tent shredded from within. No conventional explanation fully satisfies. The incident becomes a blank space, a narrative breach onto which dimensional hypotheses are projected. Similarly, locations like Skinwalker Ranch or Ong's Hat, a New Jersey-based internet hoax claiming interdimensional travel, gain mythic status not because they prove anything, but because they resist coherence. These urban legends succeed because they exploit modern anxieties about space and reality. Traditional horror relied on monsters or curses. Dimensional horror reflects fears of disconnection, derealization, and the instability of the environments we trust most. Office spaces, suburban streets, highway rest stops, mundane places become threatening not through violence, but through subtle wrongness. This taps into a psychological phenomenon known as jamais vu, the feeling that something familiar is suddenly alien. In these legends, the world remains physically intact, but conceptually wrong. Importantly, these stories rarely offer explanation. They preserve ambiguity by nature of their medium. Forum posts, found footage, TikTok videos. This format resists closure. There is no narrator to ask questions or draw conclusions. The reader is implicated simply by reading. This mimics the structure of Lovecraftian narratives, where knowledge itself is dangerous. In these modern variants, the boundary between fiction and belief collapses. Users often comment, "I've seen something like this," or "This happened to me too." The horror migrates from the page to the participatory imagination. Why does this endure? Because dimensional horror is not bound to cultural specifics. It expresses a universal disquiet, that the world we navigate may not be as sealed as it seems. In an era of algorithmic curation, fractured attention, and dislocated social space, people live increasingly at the edge of comprehension. Dimensional horror externalizes this sense of drift. It doesn't explain. It confirms a suspicion that the rules we rely on, of space, time, and coherence, are provisional. We close this section with no conclusion, only continuation. The myth of dimensional spaces persists not because people believe in it, but because it cannot be disproven. An empty stairwell in a clearing, a looping hallway in a school, a noise from behind a mirror. These are not stories we tell. They are things we notice, then try not to think about too long. In the next section, we explore how dimensional horror, once purely textual, has invaded visual, auditory, and interactive forms, spreading through media designed not to show a place, but to make you feel the world slipping around its edges. Horrifying dimensions are difficult to depict. Their power lies in what cannot be seen, in the cognitive strain of perceiving too much, too wrong, or too soon. This makes adaptation into visual or auditory media uniquely challenging. Traditional horror thrives on imagery. Dimensional horror thrives on the failure of imagery. Yet despite this, film, games, and even music have developed tools not to depict dimensions, but to approximate their effects, to make the viewer or player feel what it means to be spatially betrayed. Film adaptations often struggle to convey the ineffable, but a few succeed by leaning into suggestion and disorientation. Event Horizon 1997 is a key example. A spacecraft returns from a failed faster-than-light jump, having apparently passed through a dimension of pure chaos. The film wisely avoids showing this realm directly. Instead, it implies it through corrupted video, inexplicable behavior, and architectural distortion. A scientist describes the ship's travel as folding space, a direct nod to Lovecraftian geometry. The horror lies in exposure, not invasion. The crew saw something, and it will never leave them. The ship has returned, but it brought the wrong space back with it. More abstract is The Blair Witch Project, 1999, a film often overlooked in cosmic horror discussions. It offers no monster, no alternate realm, only the breakdown of space within the forest. Characters loop back to the same landmarks despite walking in straight lines. Their maps become useless. Space itself becomes repetitive, maliciously recursive, and indifferent to logic. This aligns with the core idea that horrifying dimensions need not appear. They can simply assert themselves by refusing to obey. Interactive media, especially video games, has proven uniquely effective at simulating dimensional horror. In Anatomy, 2016, the player explores an empty suburban home while audio tapes describe the house's rooms as analogs for organs. The house changes subtly, then drastically. Hallways warp, doors vanish, environments loop in impossible configurations. The horror is spatial, but it is also linguistic. The game crashes and reboots with glitched text and corrupted narration. Reality fractures not just for the character, but for the player, who must re-enter the game in new and unstable forms. This is not gameplay. It is procedural unreality. Control, 2019, builds a similar experience at larger scale. Set within the constantly shifting oldest house, a brutalist government building containing paranormal anomalies, the game uses shifting architecture, recursive loops, and non-Euclidean geometry to evoke spatial alienation. Dimensional intrusions are classified and contained, but never fully understood. The game's world is bureaucratic, yet surreal. Its horror lies in the disjunction between official language and incomprehensible space. Files describe staircases that lead nowhere, objects that move when unobserved, and rooms that only exist during certain mental states. Again, the horror is not monster-based. It is systemic. Even music has ventured into dimensional territory, often through texture and atmosphere rather than melody. The dungeon synth and dark ambient genres produce soundscapes that evoke impossible ruins, hollow architectures, and vast, indifferent voids. Artists like Lustmord or Atrium Carceri layer field recordings with drones, distant echoing clangs, and fractured speech to simulate the acoustic experience of a place not made for humans. Listeners report feeling as if they've entered vast subterranean complexes or stood in a space that doesn't reflect sound correctly. These albums don't tell stories, they imply spaces. Why do these adaptations succeed where others fail? Because they resist the urge to explain. The most effective dimensional horror in modern media doesn't show the thing. It shows what happens to the interface, to the camera, the player, the screen, the sound. It turns the medium itself into a dimensional artifact, corrupting it just enough to make the viewer feel unsafe, unmoored, uncertain. This approach mirrors the deeper function of dimensional horror, to simulate conceptual dislocation. In an age saturated with CGI monsters and jump scares, the refusal to depict becomes a kind of rebellion. It respects the original insight that horror does not come from what is present, but from the absence of stable coordinates. What is terrifying is not what we see, but that we no longer know where we are. In the next section, we explore how this unease has leaked beyond media into academic theory, internet subcultures, and artistic communities. Dimensional horror is no longer only a genre. It is becoming a framework through which people explain the creeping suspicion that the world does not fully add up. Dimensional horror no longer belongs to literature alone. Over the past 2 decades, it has migrated, quietly but persistently, into the language of theory, subculture, and self-description. What began as fiction about impossible spaces has become a vocabulary for expressing the unstable, surreal, and fragmented nature of lived experience. In academic papers, internet communities, and avant-garde art, the horrifying dimension is no longer just a metaphor. It is an epistemic stance, a way to articulate the feeling that the world is structurally misaligned. In academia, especially within architecture and media theory, cosmic horror has become a surprisingly fertile reference point. Scholars writing on liminality, non-Euclidean design, or derealization increasingly cite Lovecraftian tropes, not for their monsters, but for their conceptual ruptures. The oldest house from the game control has been referenced in papers on spatial theory. Mark Fisher, in his writings on The Weird and the Eerie, explores how certain spaces generate a sense of absence that is active, not what is there, but what shouldn't be there. In this sense, dimensional horror offers a framework for analyzing space as something that can rebel. Online subcultures have adopted similar patterns. Entire communities now form around experiences of liminality, the feeling of being between places, times, or identities. Reddit threads like r/bod liminal space and r/glitch, Roach in the Matrix, are filled with images and accounts that echo dimensional horror. Identical hotel hallways with no windows, parking lots stretching into fog, stairwells that go nowhere. These users are not claiming supernatural events. They're naming a feeling. This place feels wrong. And that wrongness is not tied to danger. It's tied to the sense that space is not behaving as expected. More elaborate are ARGs, alternate reality games, and collaborative mythologies like the SCP Foundation or the Backrooms Wiki. These communities construct dimensions as bureaucratic problems, documented, analyzed, but never fully contained. SCP entries frequently reference reality shifts, spatial dislocations, and anti-logic geometries. But their power lies in the tone, clinical precision applied to cosmic nonsense. This friction generates unease. The subculture isn't playing a game. It's rehearsing the language we might need when space starts to slip. In art, dimensional horror is now a theme in sculpture, installation, and even fashion. Exhibits have been built to resemble hallways that bend imperceptibly or rooms that loop. These are not horror attractions. They are designed to induce subtle cognitive dislocation. Viewers report confusion, dizziness, or a vague emotional unease. The art does not depict the impossible dimension. It simulates the conditions under which the dimension might become visible. In this way, dimensional horror shifts from narrative to experiential design. Even language has changed. Terms like dreamcore, weirdcore, and backroom vibes circulate across Tumblr, TikTok, and YouTube, describing media that feels emotionally or spatially dissonant. These are not just aesthetic preferences, they're responses to a growing collective mood, a sense that reality is slightly ajar, and that this misalignment is both frightening and comforting. Young people, in particular, use these aesthetics not just to express dread, but to locate themselves within a world that increasingly feels impermanent and unreal. What does this shift mean? Perhaps it reflects a broader transformation in how people experience reality. As daily life becomes increasingly digital, virtual, and mediated by algorithms, our spatial intuitions degrade. Navigation apps replace memory. Work happens in intangible clouds. Social spaces fragment into timelines. Dimensional horror, in this context, becomes a folk phenomenology, a way to name the dissonance between what we perceive and what we trust. The dimension is no longer fiction. It's a tool for articulating the sensation of conceptual drift. Yet, crucially, this appropriation has not defanged the horror. Instead, it has naturalized it. People now describe real, locations, emotional states, and psychological breaks in dimensional terms. A depressive episode becomes falling into a different layer. A childhood memory is described as feeling like the backrooms. The language of horrifying dimensions survives because it maps onto experiences we have no other words for. In the final section, we will return to the philosophical root of it all, why these ideas linger. What is it about dimensional horror that refuses to be forgotten? Why do these impossible spaces continue to surface across fiction, myth, media, and selfhood, as if they were not invented, but waiting to be remembered? We now arrive at the edge, not of a story, but of a concept. Horrifying dimensions persist not because they scare us, but because they refract something fundamental. They name a suspicion buried deep in modern consciousness, that reality is contingent, permeable, and not built for us. These dimensions do not simply haunt fiction or games. They haunt thought itself. The more we develop tools to understand the universe, the more we encounter the possibility that understanding was never part of the design. This is where cosmic horror diverges from other traditions. Gothic fiction suggests repressed truths. Supernatural horror suggests violated moral orders. But dimensional horror suggests no order at all, not even one we can break. To glimpse another dimension is not to uncover secrets, but to realize that our world was never whole. We believed in continuity, in scale, in logic. Dimensional horror responds. Those are local illusions. What you call reality may be the thinnest layer, temporary, interpretable, and increasingly unstable. Philosophically, this touches on the terror of epistemic fragility, the idea that our sense of meaning depends on assumptions that are never truly tested until they fail. Time flows forward. Objects occupy space. Events follow causes, but horrifying dimensions pull us into frames where these rules do not apply, or worse, apply differently. The horror is not merely that the universe is vast. It is that vastness has no edge, and therefore neither do we. There may be nothing outside us, and nothing inside either. Identity, locality, sanity, all become dimensional artifacts, stable only under specific spatial conditions. Psychologically, these ideas resonate because they mimic real cognitive breakdowns. The experience of derealization, where the world feels unreal or staged, echoes the structure of dimensional horror precisely. In both cases, space remains visible but loses trust. One knows where they are, but not what being there means. Similarly, trauma often alters perception. Time distorts. Memory fragments. Familiar places feel distant. The horror is not an external threat. It's in the failure of internal anchoring. The mind no longer corresponds to the world. This may explain why dimensional horror endures even in the absence of belief. Few people literally think they'll fall into Rulia or walk into the back rooms. But they recognize the structure. They feel it in bureaucracy that loops without outcome, in spaces that numb the self, in days that repeat without reason. Dimensional horror doesn't invent fear. It gives it a formless form, a way to narrate what disorientation feels like when orientation fails. The persistence of these dimensions also reflects our cultural shift toward unresolvable knowledge. Scientific frontiers, quantum mechanics, multiverse theory, simulation hypotheses, suggest not clear answers, but answers that require us to rethink what an answer even is. In that context, the horrifying dimension becomes symbolic of a new cosmic humility. We no longer seek dominion over reality. We wonder if reality was ever structured for us to find. As Lovecraft warned, the most merciful thing in the world is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. Yet dimensional horror doesn't preach despair. Its tone is often solemn, not nihilistic. The fear it inspires is not of death, but of irrelevance, of discovering that human concepts, truth, self, order, do not generalize. There may be things that exist that cannot be known, not because they are hidden, but because our knowing was never an included possibility. This redefines horror from external invasion to structural omission. So where does this leave us? With a question that refuses to close. The horror of impossible dimensions lingers not because they are alien, but because they feel pre-existing, as if we are remembering something we were not supposed to notice. The door was always there, the angles never aligned, and deep down we have always known that the space we call home may not be the whole place. This is the final revelation, and it is not a twist. It is a lens. Dimensional horror does not end. It simply changes the frame, leaving us not with answers, but with a feeling that cannot be unfelt. A realization we were never meant to reach. The stories are done. The implications remain.